people turn out tonight for this wonderful conversation we're going to have with Ben Goldfarb about bridging the future on wildlife crossings and connectivity. It's such an honor to be able to host Ben and to have all of you here tonight. My name is Peter Metcalf, and I'm the Executive Director of Glacier-Two Medicine Alliance. And this is the first time that, to my knowledge, we've ever hosted an event over here in Whitefish and in the Flathead Valley. So we weren't sure what we were going to see in turnout, and this is awesome.
It's
so
awesome.
Thank you. Tonight is the last stop on Ben's, we should say, was it 6-city tour, 6-community tour in Western Montana. He's been on tour at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation and Yellowstone Safe Passages to Livingston and Bozeman and Big Sky and Missoula and the Tonga Wildlife Refuge in Corvallis, and now we're happy to be able to co-host him up here tonight for this event. I want to give also thanks tonight to the Whitefish Community Center for making this space available free of charge to us, and for Brookworks who made arrangements for the books. So Ben wrote a fabulous book. He's going to talk about it, but if you don't have it, I strongly recommend that you buy it tonight. And
all right, Peter, I agree, Peter.
Yeah. Real quick before I formally introduce Ben, I just want to share briefly about Glacier-Two Medicine Alliance for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We're a grassroots conservation organization that's based in East Glacier Park. We were founded back in 1984 with the primary purpose at that time to protect the Badger-Two medicine from oil and gas drilling. And due to the work of many people over the years in our organization and leadership of the Blackfeet Nation and other conservation partners, including some over here today, such as NPCA, National Parks Conservation Association. Thank you, Sarah, for being here. Last September, we succeeded in eliminating the last of the 47 oil and gas leaks. An amazing testament to long-term commitment and stick with it through many odds and partnerships, and it's really a great accomplishment. We have continued to work on a number of issues related to Badger-Two medicine, to lands conservation on the front, Glacier Park, the Middle Fork corridor. We've been heavily involved and locally in a lot of wildlife management issues, particularly around grizzly bears, weeds management, and other such issues. But one of the projects we're starting to take on and trying to do some more work to help galvanize is around wildlife connectivity, particularly in the Highway 2 corridor. And as Ben will talk about tonight, these projects, it's one of the critical threats to our wildlife and to our landscapes is our roads and how they impact them. It's far more than just death. But it's also, these projects often to mitigate that can take a long time and long processes. And some people in this room have been working on that issue in Highway 2 in a much more engaged way than I have for many years, and due to the work that some of them have been doing, we have a fair amount of knowledge that's already been built around that corridor. So that's something we're going to be working on. We'll talk a little bit at the end about ways you can help with some of that project as a citizen scientist if you're interested. But that's one of the places we're going as an organization. So afterwards, please stick around, buy a book, get Ben to sign it, pick up some info from the info booth that we have back there, have some conversation. We have some tea and coffee and some sparkling waters back there as well, so you can help yourself to that. And if you need to get up during the presentation to go to the bathroom, it's in the back, past the American flag before you go out the building. So with that, I want to introduce Ben Goldfarb. Ben's a journalist, and he has written for many magazines, most notably, in my opinion, High Country News, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, National Geographic, and many others. He writes mostly on wildlife conservation and fisheries management. He's written some great stuff on salmon, in addition to grizzly bears and wildlife connectivity. But he's probably most known for his work around beavers, in which he wrote a previous book called Eager, which is also quite excellent. That book won the 2019 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. His latest book, Crossings, has been selected as a finalist for the New York Public Library's Book Award, the Reading the West Award, and the Colorado Book Award, and it was listed as one of 2023's best books by the New York Times. So, that's credibility. However, as much as I think Ben's a great guy, I learned something about him today that he says brings into question his character and judgment. He's a Mets fan.
Well, I thought.
Went over to Ben, and we're really grateful for that.
Thanks a lot. Well, I really thought that in Montana the Mets were going to be off limits, but I guess not. Well, thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thanks for Peter, to Peter for inviting me to come up here as part of my Montana fishing trip, thinly masquerading as a book tour. So it's really a joy to be here, not least because my introduction to this subject and the origin of this book occurred in the Flathead Valley on the wildlife crossings on Highway 93 that every single person in this room is undoubtedly familiar with. You know, I first toured those wildlife crossings in the fall of 2013, and this book came out a full decade later in the fall of 2023. And so it's kind of a beautiful full circle moment for me to be back here and to drive under the overpass in Arley on the way up here this afternoon. So thank you all so much again for inviting me here and for being here this evening. So this conversation tonight and this book is about the science of road ecology. And who here had heard that term before tonight? Is that a familiar term to you guys? Yeah, so for the uninitiated, you know, road ecology is basically this relatively small but fast-growing field of science that looks at all of the different ways that roads impact nature and transform nature. And I think most important, what we can do about those interactions and relationships, which of course are so often negative for wildlife and for ecosystems. And roads, of course, are so transformative, first of all, because there are just so many of them, right? How many miles of road do we have in the US? Any guesses? A gajillion. That's you're in the right ballpark. Yeah, we have approximately a gajillion roads. We have around 4 million miles of road in the United States. There are something like 40 million miles of road around the world, and there are about 15 million miles more that are essentially being built in the next decade or two. We're in the middle of this period known as the infrastructure tsunami, this wave of new construction that's sweeping our planet. And you know, I think in part because roads are ubiquitous, we don't really think about them all that much, right? We, you know, sort of use them every day without giving it a whole lot of thought. You know, they're somewhat, again, they're somewhat invisible. You know, we take them for granted, right? You know, here I am driving 10,000 miles to promote my book about the ills of driving, right? So, you know, we're all using these features, and you know, I think as a result, we tend to think about these features when we do think about them in fundamentally positive terms. You know, roads are how we get to schools and hospitals and grocery stores. They're how we all got here tonight, right? You know, and of course, they have this great cultural valence in the United States. You know, they're these symbols of human mobility and freedom and momentum. You know, sort of lionized by Jack Kerouac and Bruce Springsteen, right? And you know, that's somewhat ironic because for all of the freedom and mobility and movement that roads provide for us humans, of course, they deny wild animals the ability to move safely and freely around the landscape. And they do that at a scale that's almost hard to fathom. And of course, they do that most conspicuously and directly by killing animals, you know, via roadkill. How many animals are killed by cars in the US? Vertebrate animals, backboned animals. Let's say every day. How many animals are killed by cars every day? A gazillion, yeah. A gazillion, a gajillion. You guys are really good at math here in Whitefish. Yeah, so believe it or not, there are more than 1 million animals killed by cars every day. And again, those are vertebrates, right? To say nothing of the insects or arachnids. Just really hard to fathom. And that's likely, that million figure, that's likely a dramatic underestimate. That came from some Humane Society surveys in the 60s and 70s. We know that roadkill rates have increased for most taxa since then. So the number is likely quite a bit higher, that we don't really know. And I think that in general, because the animals that we tend to see along the road are, logically enough, the common ones, we don't really think about roadkill as a conservation crisis, right? I think that, we have this way of saying, maybe subconsciously, well, lots of raccoons and gray squirrels are getting hit, but there are lots of those critters out there, right? So what's the big deal if a few, white-tailed deer get hit? But of course, we know that there are dozens of federally threatened and endangered species for which vehicle collisions are one of the primary sources of mortality, right? From tiger salamanders to Florida panthers to ocelots to grizzly bears, relevantly up here. So it's truly an immense conservation crisis. And, as road ecologists have observed, today roadkill is the leading direct human cause of vertebrate mortality on land, which is just a fancy scientific way of saying there is literally nothing that we do that kills more wild animals directly than drive, right? And briefly, I think that one of the things that makes roadkill so pernicious and tragic is the way that it hijacks evolution. You think about the kind of the defense mechanisms of so many common beloved creatures, from turtles that withdraw into shells, to skunks that spray, to porcupines who bristle their quills, right? These are all kind of these hunker down and stand your ground defense mechanisms that worked really well for thousands of generations against wolves and mountain lions and other natural predators. But, when your predator is an F-150 barreling down Highway 93 at 70 miles an hour, the worst thing you can do is hunker down and stand your ground, right? So roadkill takes evolutionary history and renders it not only moot, but actually maladaptive. I find that kind of tragic to contemplate. So those direct collisions are again, the most obvious way that roads and nature interact, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg. And Road Ecology looks at all of these different connections that roads and nature, forge with each other. Roads are vectors of invasive species, right? So many plants and animals, non-native plants and animals, basically enter ecosystems along a grid. One of the places I went in working on this book was the Lolo National Forest. And, there we visited this road where for decades, invasive thistle seeds had been transported in logging truck tire treads. And then all of those thistles kind of bloomed at once, and you've got this eerie, linear, purple strip of non-native vegetation across the landscape. Roads are zones of erosion. Here's a question for you guys. Who's the largest road manager on Earth? What entity? U.S. Forest Service, yeah. I would ask you how many miles of Forest Service road there are, but somebody's going to say a gajillion. So we'll just give it. So the Forest Service manages 370,000 miles of roads. You could go to the moon and most of the way back on logging roads. And of course, the vast majority of those roads are unpaved. They don't have a whole lot of traffic, but they pose this huge kind of erosional challenge, right? You get a big snowmelt event or a rainfall event, and those dirt roads just turn liquid, and they, sediment. They pour sediment into, fish or amphibian-bearing streams. So, roads are this kind of geological and hydrological problem as well as an ecological problem. Roads are also a kind of a chemical issue, right? Our cars are constantly bleeding cadmium and zinc and copper and microplastics and tire particles and all kinds of stuff that's, transforming aquatic ecosystems especially. We also add 20 million tons of road salt as a de-icing agent to our highways every year, which basically means we've turned our highways into salt licks, right? We draw animals to the pavement to access that mineral resource, and that creates very dangerous situations. So roads are potentially ecological traps, right? I will say that the road salt issue inspired my favorite road sign in Jasper National Park in Canada. Every winter you can see signs that say, "Do not let moose lick your car." And I'm not sure you could stop a moose from licking your car. I think if a moose is motivated, it's going to lick your car. But that's the kind of strange ecological connections that roads create. Roads are hellscapes of noise, right? I think Peter and I will probably talk about this in a minute, but imagine being a male meadowlark. You have to sing to attract a mate, but if your prospective mate can't hear you over the constant rumble of engines and tires, you fundamentally can't live in that place, right? So that, that road effect zone, that noise pollution kind of sonic window is quite a bit wider than the road itself, right? And that din of traffic is chasing animals away from vast swaths of habitat as well as impacting our own health. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? We know that, yes, roads destroy ecosystems, but they also create novel ecosystems in some cases. We know that animals are kind of endlessly flexible and creative and adaptive, and they have a kind of an impressive way of taking advantage of the concrete habitat we engineer for them. In working on this book, I went to Minnesota, and there's a kind of a highway overpass, and there were hundreds of little brown bats roosting in the crevices on the underside of this overpass, right? So, animals taking advantage of the resources we give them. Another example of that, of course, are scavengers, right? We've turned our roads into these, endless carrion trails, and ravens and magpies and bald eagles and golden eagles are all really good at taking advantage of that carcass resource we've created. But of course, that's a dangerous resource to access, right? If you're a bald eagle in the Methow Valley with a belly full of venison, it takes you a minute to achieve liftoff, right? And you're at risk of becoming roadkill yourself. And in fact, thousands of eagles, golden eagles and bald eagles, are killed by cars every year. So the road is a resource, yes, but it's also, again, potentially an ecological trap. So these collisions between animals and vehicles, right? They're not just dangerous for the animals themselves, of course. They're also dangerous for us as drivers. And of course, the primary animal that features in these collisions, right, are deer, whitetail and mule deer. And the number of deer vehicle collisions or DVCs that happen constantly and their economic and human health and safety cost is really, again, kind of hard to fathom. How many deer vehicle collisions are there in the US every year? There are a gazillion, yeah. There are up to 2 million deer collisions every year, which is, again, probably an underestimate since the vast majority go unreported. That means there's a deer collision every 30 seconds or so in the US. The average deer collision costs more than $9,000 to society in hospital bills and vehicle repairs and insurance costs and all of the other costs associated with large animal collisions. And more than 400 drivers are killed every year in deer crashes, which make deer the single most dangerous wild animal in North America. And of course, it's not the deer's fault, right? But that's the situation that we have created. And I'll add that, as probably most of you know, this problem is especially acute in Montana, right? That Montana ranks number 2 year after year in per capita large animal collisions. And of course, most of those collisions, again, are deer. What state is number 1, by the way? Anybody know? Pennsylvania? They're in the top 5, yeah, but Minnesota, West Virginia is actually number 1 in the rankings many years running. But Pennsylvania is usually, they're usually up there. And of course, deer aren't the only large animal out there, right? We know that the average deer collision costs $9,000. Well, the average elk collision costs $20,000. The average moose collision costs more than $40,000, right? So again, these are incredibly dangerous, expensive events. So that collision between animal and vehicle, that's an enormous problem, but in a sense, it's only half the problem for wildlife, or one part of the problem. And in a sense, the bigger problem for at least some animals is the barrier to movement that highways create, right? Scientists talk about this idea of a moving fence on many highways, this wall of impenetrable traffic that animals can't get through. And in some cases, that moving fence and the loss of the ability to move around the landscape can be almost worse than roadkill itself. And to illustrate that point, one of the chapters of this book is about ungulate migrations in southwestern Wyoming, mule deer, elk, pronghorn, and one of the places I visited was the Red Desert, and there's this big herd, a very, very famous herd of migratory mule deer who walk hundreds of miles every year from their winter range to their summer range and back again. And scientists have put satellite collars on these animals so they know where they hang out. And so here's a map of the satellite collar locations from this herd of mule deer in the Red Desert. And this is their winter range. Those purple blobs are where the deer like to do their thing. And what you can see very clearly is that here's this white line across the bottom of the screen is I-80, right? And no deer get past I-80. And that's a big problem because all of the really good winter range is south of I-80. Historically, these deer probably went as far south as Colorado, where I live now. But during harsh winters, they'll pool up on the north side of that highway looking for a gap in traffic and not finding one. And some years, 40% of that deer herd will actually starve because they can't access the entirety of their winter range. And again, that's a more severe problem potentially than roadkill itself. A herd of 1,000 deer could handle a few collisions on the highway. What they can't handle is losing access to all of that really good habitat. Here's another very famous map around here that illustrates much the same point. These are the movements of a single young male grizzly bear a couple years ago. What was this bear's name, by the way? Anybody know? Rob? Yeah, Lindenpolter. Yeah, this is a famous young male grizzly bear who basically spent many months trying to cross I-90, right, and get south into the Bitterroot there. And basically every red X on the screen along that white line is a place where that bear approached the highway and bounced off like a ping pong ball, right, looking for a gap in traffic and not finding one. So this bear spent many months, attempted 46 crossings before he finally made it through a kind of a natural bridge over here on the far left side of the screen. So again, imagine being that bear. That road is 150 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder, and yet it's denying you access to hundreds of thousands of acres of habitat, right? So what do we do about it? We have these kind of two linked problems. We have these wildlife vehicle collisions that we know are really dangerous and problematic for humans and animals, and we have this fragmentation issue, right? This barrier effect that roads create. How do we solve that issue? And the best tool in our toolbox are wildlife crossings, right? Overpasses, underpasses, culverts, all of these different structures that basically allow animals to safely move from one side of the road to another. Anybody recognize this wildlife crossing? This is in Colorado. This is on Highway 160 near Durango. This gets used by 14 elk per day. Pretty cool. So this concept of wildlife crossing construction, this really began in Europe in the 1950s. France built the first, followed quickly by Germany, Switzerland, Austria, other Western European countries. Today, the Netherlands is really the best at this sort of thing. Of course, the Dutch are the world's best engineers. This is a very famous Dutch overpass that crosses two highways, one railroad track, one business park, and a field hockey complex, and is a kilometer long, right, and kind of dwarfs anything we've done here in the US. The place that wildlife crossings were sort of popularized and really took off was, where's that? Banff. That's Banff National Park, right? And Banff, like many quote-unquote protected areas, has a highway running through the middle of it, the Trans-Canada Highway. So starting in the 1980s, Parks Canada built around 40 wildlife crossings, including 6 overpasses. The overpasses were primarily intended for grizzly bears, which much prefer to go over highways than under them. Lots of research from Banff showed that these structures were incredibly effective, especially for bears. The sows with cubs used them. The cubs became crossers. They taught their cubs. There was kind of this cool intergenerational learning process that basically healed this genetic divide that the Trans-Canada Highway had created. Here in the US, the first wildlife crossings were built in the late 60s and 1970s in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, states with large migratory herds of ungulates. The reason for that is that mule deer especially tend to be a pretty easy animal to mitigate for. You get a herd of several hundred mule deer crossing a highway in the same place year after year on a migration route, there's often a big pile of carcasses saying, hey, put the wildlife crossing right here, right? Those migratory ungulates were really good early kind of case studies that convinced other transportation departments to get on board. A really important piece of road mitigation are fences. People tend to get very focused on the crossing structures themselves, but the fences are what make the crossings work, right? The fences funnel the animals to the crossings. The fences are really there to reduce roadkill. The crossings are there to provide connectivity. Those two pieces, work hand in hand, right? So you really have to have the fences generally to make the crossings themselves effective. I think another really important thing that road ecologists have learned over time is just the importance of providing kind of a diversity of crossing opportunities for wildlife. Obviously, we're very focused on the large ungulates and the listed grizzly bears, but there's a whole ecosystem out there which is fragmented by highways, and so providing structures that allow all of those different critters to cross is really important. So here's one example of that. This is an overpass on I-90 up on Snoqualmie Pass near Seattle. The overpass is primarily for elk, another animal who generally prefers going over highways than under. But here you can see that they've also bolted into place all of these log structures, which provide micro habitat for rodents and reptiles and all kinds of other smaller critters, who use that structure. Just thinking about the whole ecosystem, I think is really important. Another good example of that, this is an underpass, also on I-90, also in Washington State. This is, again, up on Snoqualmie Pass. And up there, they've got pikas, right? And pikas, as you probably know, live in talus fields. So if you're going to have connectivity for pikas, you need a little artificial talus field running through the underpass, right? Which is kind of cool to see. So again, just thinking about all of those different road users. And it's also really important that we provide aquatic opportunities, right, in the form of enlarged culverts that allow otters and beavers and amphibians to use those stream corridors under roadways as well. We'll skip that. So the most common objection you hear to wildlife crossings is that at first glance, they seem expensive, right? These days, typical underpass is going to cost you around $500,000. An overpass is going to run $8 to $10 million. And that sounds, there's some sticker shock there, right? That sounds like a lot of money to spend, helping deer and elk cross the road. But, I'll say a couple things. First is that in the context of transportation budgets, that is not much money at all, right? It's $1 million a mile to repave a highway. $8 million for an overpass is not that big a deal. I was just down in Big Sky and Bozeman, and there, that stretch of Highway 191, MDOT has allocated something like $500 million for repairs on that highway corridor in the next few decades. So again, $8 to $10 million to help animals cross a highway, not that big a deal. And then, the other really important thing to remember about these projects is that they have this great way of paying for themselves, right? We know that crashes are really expensive. So if you build a structure that prevents a lot of crashes, DOTs can recoup their own money pretty quickly. This is an overpass in Wyoming for pronghorn. And, when this was proposed, YDOT sort of wrung their hands and said, really, we're going to spend, $5 million helping antelope cross a highway? That sounds kind of nuts. And this structure paid for itself in less than 5 years by preventing crashes. And I think the other important thing I'll mention about that too is that look, not every wildlife crossing has to be a $10 million overpass. There's a lot we can do with the infrastructure already on the landscape through retrofits and other inexpensive tweaks. And here's one good example of that. This is a culvert under I-64 in Virginia near a white-tailed deer collision hotspot. And this structure was not built for wildlife, right? This was just built for the seasonal movement of water. But, what VDOT realized is that, hey, if we fence off the highway on either side of that pre-existing culvert, we can make animals use it, right? And so that's what they did. They built a couple miles of fences on either side of that culvert. They reduced crashes by 90%. They induced a 4-fold increase in deer usage of that culvert, right? So again, you're making the deer use the culvert, and guess what? They use the culvert. And I think most important for VDOT is that this project recouped its own costs in under 2 years, right? By, again, preventing lots of expensive crashes. So, again, not every crossing has to be this $10 million outlay, right? There's so much we can do with what is already on the landscape. Of course, there's one caveat to all of this. In general, DOTs take this very cost-benefit focused approach, right? They want to build wildlife crossings that pay for themselves and protect driver safety. That means that we've built a lot of wildlife crossings for large ungulates and not many for frogs and toads and salamanders and turtles and rodents and smaller critters, right? Nobody's ever totaled their car hitting a northern red-legged frog, but we know that amphibians especially are some of the most road-endangered animals on Earth. So we need to, yes, build more deer and elk passages, but let's think about the smaller critters as well. And then, the final thing that I'll say is that we're at this kind of amazing moment in the history of road ecology and wildlife crossings. There's more opportunity for these sorts of projects than ever. The 2021 Infrastructure Act included $350 million in grant funding for wildlife crossings. Montana's already gotten some of that money in the first cycle of grants for some assessments on I-90, and hopefully a lot more money will be coming to this state in the next couple of rounds of this process. And we can talk about that too if you're curious. But the point is that we have a long way to go when it comes to funding this issue properly. But $350 million is a half decent start. So again, I just mentioned at the start of this that my own interest in this topic really originated on Highway 93, and that's a story that I'm sure most of you are well versed in and familiar with. But as you may recall, in the 1990s and early 2000s, when MDT first proposed widening Highway 93 as it passed through the Flathead Reservation, that whole project happened because the Confederated Salish and Kootenai objected to that idea of highway widening, right, and basically forced the state to include around 40 wildlife crossings on 93. And just the beautiful sentiment or the beautiful concept that the tribes voiced at the time was that the road should be a visitor to the landscape, right? That respects the land and the spirit of place. And I think that's just a really powerful idea that should guide this work moving forward, right? What does it mean for a road to be a visitor to a landscape, and how do we make our roads visitors rather than conquerors? I think that's just a really provocative concept. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much. That we do have, after this conversation, I'd love to sign a book for you. I'll mention that, it was named one of the best books of this year by both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So liberals and conservatives united around the concept of habitat connectivity. And truly, this is truly a rare, nonpartisan environmental issue, right? A recent public poll in Colorado, where I live, found that 85% of residents support more wildlife crossings, and the numbers are the same here in Montana. So this is something that we can all get behind, whether we're hunters or Humane Society members. So with that, thank you guys, and I'm looking forward to chatting with Peter and all of you.
Ben, thank you for the work you've been doing on this book and the way it's raising the profile of this issue for a lot of people, myself included. I learned a lot reading this book, and I've been involved in some way with Road Ecology since 2007 when I wrote a report as a graduate student. And like you, I had the privilege sometime around 2013 or 2014 with a group of students for a class I was teaching in University of Montana toured the wildlife crossing structures with Marcel Husser. And one of the students in that class now is Salish and works for the tribal wildlife department there and continues to provide reports back to me on the effectiveness of those crossings. And so they were very insightful on what I learned. But so I want to come back to those in a moment. But before we do, I want to talk about just a little bit more about some of the impacts. First of all, I want to linger on that statistic you gave us at the beginning, because I think probably for a lot of us, we think about roads and it's death.
Yeah.
A million animals a year.
A day.
A day.
Yeah.
A day killed in the U.S. alone.
Yeah.
And that doesn't count all of the insects and invertebrates that we smash on a given day. So I think you said it's something like 21 species in the U.S. are one of the causes of their decline is directly attributed to wildlife vehicle collisions. I think you wrote in the book. Yeah,
I think it's 21 federally listed species for which vehicle collisions are the primary source of mortality. So for ocelots, for example, there are fewer than 100 ocelots left in the United States. All in South Texas, and roadkill is 40% of ocelot mortality, right? So that's a species that we're losing right now, because of vehicle collisions. This is a really happy book, by the way, I should say.
Yeah, that was just remarkable.
Yeah.
To think about how much death. And when you wrote about the one thing I also found interesting is when you write about the moving fence phenomenon.
Yeah.
Trying to how we help solve these problems is that at some point in time, you drive along the highway and you see the places where there's skunks and deer and all the visible death. and you're like, man, this isn't good.
Yeah.
But you read about how at some point in time, highways actually, you don't see a lot of roadkill
Right.
along highways. And so I wonder if you can unpack that a little bit more in terms of the correlation with traffic volumes and that fence effect, and how that varies a little bit across taxa.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, yeah, it's a really good point because, along many interstate highways especially, you really don't see a lot of roadkill, right? And the reason for that is that the traffic volumes can get so high that animals just never attempt to cross, right? I mean, especially ungulates. We know that ungulates are basically trying to find gaps in traffic to run through. But, if there's never a gap in traffic, they never try to run through, right? And so, I think there are lots of situations where, a lot of DOTs basically say, hey, there's because we're taking a driver safety focused approach, there is no problem here, right? There's not a lot of roadkill because animals aren't trying to cross, and so there's not an issue to mitigate. So like that slide that I showed of deer in the red desert in southwestern Wyoming, for example, that's, from a connectivity perspective, right? You would desperately need a wildlife crossing there to allow those animals to access the entirety of their winter range. But from a crash prevention perspective, which is the perspective that DOTs tend to take, there's no issue, right? Because again, the deer don't get hit because they don't try to cross. And so that carcass data that you guys and others are collecting is it's such an important data layer in identifying roadkill hotspots. But we also need other data layers like satellite collar data to tell us where animals are approaching highways, but not necessarily making it across.
And I think, and Tabitha or Lori, who are here today, can probably speak to this a little more specifically, but John Waller, the park biologist, identified for Highway 2, for example, that it's somewhere around like 2,000 vehicles a day starts to act as a fence for grizzly bears, where in your book you said it's around 10,000 for deer. So when you start to see, or maybe I got the wrong unit.
No, you got it, yeah.
There's quite a bit of difference there, but for highway departments, I've heard that, trying to get them to focus on certain taxa can be a challenge. And in your experience, to what extent are you seeing highway departments motivated by these taxa that are have less significant human or property damage costs to them?
Yeah, I would say not very motivated. I think that again, the vast majority of mitigation we do is for large ungulates. And sometimes a federal listing will compel mitigation. And that's partly what's happening on Highway 90. Here in Montana. Eastern states have done a little more. So they've built tunnels for salamanders and culverts for turtles. They've done a little more amphibian mitigation, but there still really aren't many examples out there, of American road mitigation for animals that don't directly threaten human safety. And I'll add that that's one of the things that Marcel Hazard talks about a lot, right? Is that European countries do a lot more of this. You can go to you can go to the Netherlands, and see all kinds of underpasses for toads and hedgehogs and polecats and badgers, all kinds of sort of micro and mesofauna. But we don't do that in the U.S. generally, or at least we don't yet.
And the next, along that line, next thing I want to ask you about, Ben, one of my favorite chapter titles I've ever seen was chapter 6 of your book, The Blab of the Pave. But it's this chapter on noise and the effect of the sonic footprint of roads. And most of the book, crossing structures, for example, are great for moving animals across, overcoming the moving fence or the direct death that you talked about. But could you unpack a little bit more for us the sonic footprint? I thought that was really fascinating, particularly the research that was done in Idaho about the Phantom Road, where they were able to document how much animals were displaced and the loss of fitness for wildlife that lived. In this case, they're looking at birds, but along the highway. Yeah.
So that Phantom Road experiment that Peter's referring to, I think it's one of the landmark experiments in the history of road ecology because it just demonstrated the immense impact that noise alone can have on animals. And so basically what those researchers at Boise State University did was they recorded the noise of traffic, and not from I-90, from going to the Sun Road, right? So a park road in a protected area. And then they played that traffic noise through speakers in an otherwise roadless part of the forest during bird migration season. And they found a couple of things. First, they found that lots of birds avoided the area altogether, right? But, I think almost more interesting is that they found that some of the birds who did remain ended up in worse body condition, and they basically didn't gain weight or they lost weight. And the reason for that is that, so you can imagine if you're a little yellow-rumped warbler, you're constantly listening for the threat of predators, right? You have to hear the flap of a goshawk's wings or the sound of a bobcat creeping through the underbrush. But if you can't hear those sounds because they're drowned out by traffic noise, you have to look around for predators instead. And every second that you're looking for predators is one that you're not eating, beetles or berries or what have you. And so there's this trade-off between, sort of vigilance and foraging. And animals that have to be hyper-vigilant in the presence of road noise don't do enough foraging. So, so those kinds of subtle effects, right, are so hard to quantify. It's hard enough to count, dead warblers on a roadside, but how many songbirds don't, complete their migration to Central America because they were in slightly worse body condition because they, had to forage along a roadside, And so those kinds of subtle indirect effects, I think, they're hard to study, but they're potentially incredibly profound.
Yeah. And I was struck by this the other day because Renee and I, like many people, bike going to the Sun Road, and it's amazing how much you can hear the bird life or listen to all the berry thrushes and swings and thrushes and stuff. And then the other day, we biked in the evening and the morning and opened up the cars, and I don't remember hearing any birds while I was driving. Probably I was going 35 or 40 miles an hour and had the window down. But what struck me is, sometimes I've seen those sonic footprints, and you said it extends 3 miles at minimum out on each side of that highway in that corridor. And there's been talk about there and probably elsewhere about how other types of vehicles, particularly non-combustion, internal combustion engines, may help reduce some of that footprint. And I was wondering what your research has shown about sonic impacts of non-combustion engine vehicles. I thought it was very interesting, both with electric vehicles and automated self-driving vehicles.
Yeah. So, when you hear traffic noise, you're really hearing two different things, right? You're hearing engine noise, but you're also hearing tire noise. And there's actually a threshold around 35 miles an hour when what you're hearing is primarily tire noise. When you hear like the distant hiss of an interstate, what you're mostly hearing are little pockets of air in tire treads popping as the tires go along the highway, right? So, you can imagine that the replacement of our internal combustion vehicles with electric vehicles, that will help with some noise impacts at lower speeds. I think that'll be a really big deal in cities. And we know that road noise is this huge problem for human health, right? That road noise pollution is elevating our cortisol levels and blood pressures and risk of cardiac disease and stroke and all of these maladies. So electrification will help with that kind of urban noise issue, but I don't think it's going to help a whole lot with road noise at highway speeds, outside of cities.
And last question on noise, but is there any solutions or any attention that's being given by transportation planners or land managers that you encountered to try to reduce the sonic footprint of roads in a way that benefits wildlife? Yeah,
it's a tough one because the most common tool in the noise reduction toolbox are those sound barriers along roadsides, right? But those are also a connectivity issue for wildlife, and they work immediately next to the highway, but they also have this way of kind of funneling noise upslope. You can really hear that in Missoula very, very clearly. So it's a tough problem. There are some places in Europe have experimented with quiet pavement, which is basically this pavement type with little divots in it that somehow dampens the tire noise, especially. There was, I think the Death Valley National Park did a quiet pavement experiment, but maintaining the quiet pavement requires vacuuming the road to suck up the grit that gets in the little divots, and good luck getting MDT to vacuum its roads.
Thinking about solutions, one of the things I loved about your book was the people that you focused on. And you quoted early on my favorite one of my favorite authors, Barry Lopez, who
Yeah.
talked about kind of our blasé acceptance of the amount of death. He writes, "We treat the attrition of lives on the road like the attrition of lives at war, horrifying, unavoidable, justified." But then you went and told all these wonderful stories of people who are clearly unwilling to accept it.
Yeah.
I love the story of the volunteers in Portland who are picking up those red-legged frogs in buckets
Yeah.
to carry them across a railroad track and like a schoolyard and a highway, and it's only a distance of what, maybe 50 meters, 100 meters, a couple hundred meters.
Yeah.
Like that. It wasn't super long, but to put them into their wetland.
Yeah.
Or a gentleman in Florida who single-handedly like tried to save all these turtles.
Yeah.
And they were getting just annihilated. And I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about, as you met these people, these heroes, like what is it about this issue that motivated some people to go to such length, and any insights on how that could be spread to, from what they were doing, just infect and encourage more people to similarly passionate.
Right. It's a good question. I think, some people just have this incredible sense of compassion for wildlife, and I'm sure that's true of so many of the people in this room. To me, one of the most interesting places that I went in working on this book was Australia. There's a chapter in there about roadkill in Tasmania, and Tasmania has the highest roadkill rates on Earth, and it's especially poignant there because the animals are marsupials, as you probably know, right? And marsupials, the females carry their babies, their joeys, in a frontal pouch. So what often happens is that the female marsupial will be hit by a car and die, and that the joey, the baby, will survive in that pouch. And so there are hundreds of people on this little tiny island who drive around checking the pouches of dead marsupials and extracting the live joeys within, and then raising them to adulthood, which can take years in some cases. It's kind of like eerie. You drive around and they'll check a pouch, and then they'll spray paint the animal so that everybody else knows not to check that animal. And so you see, it's like this weird public art project where all of the animals are spray painted. But I just find that so beautiful in the sense that I think that, and again, I'm sure this is not true of many people in this room, but I think that generally Americans, we have this kind of roadkill blindness, right? We habituate to it, or we just ignore it. We kind of have to we have to be heedless of the carnage along our roadsides in order to function in some ways. If you pay too much attention to that constant violence, it can be hard to live in some cases. And so we have this way, I think, of ignoring roadkill, whereas in Tasmania, people they not only don't ignore roadkill, they actively seek it out, right? And so they're constantly paying attention to this violence and gravitating toward it rather than away from it. And I think there's something really powerful in that, right? What does it mean to as Barry Lopez does, kind of pay tribute to these animals and notice them rather than turning away from them.
Yeah, I thought those stories were just really powerful, but they also highlighted that not the futility is the wrong word, but that the unsustainability of a lot of those solutions. Like, we're not going to be able to move frogs forever using bucket brigades.
Well, right. That's a good example because that frog bucket brigade in Portland, they've proposed an underpass for those frogs, and that would be a $3 million project under a major federal highway, and it's really hard to scrounge up $3 million for a frog underpass, right? If it was an elk collision issue, that would have been done already. But those small animals, it's tough to get DOTs to care about them.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that. I got like two other questions before we come back to the cost, and that is looking at these bigger structures, the ones but even the small ones.
Yeah.
What is the measurement of what makes a wildlife crossing work? Is it the 14 elk that go across it? Is it the savings from white-tailed deer collisions? And there's lots of different perspectives, but I'm just curious, when you were talking to people, what were some of the things that stood out amongst road ecologists which I'm sure they have a different perspective than highway engineers on what makes for an effective structure?
Yeah, it's a good question. You're right that there are many different ways to measure success. Maybe it's collision reduction. Maybe it's of course, usage is is sort of the key one, right? And we know again that that animals use these structures very readily, right? The crossings on Highway 93. Those have collectively passed hundreds of thousands of animals at this point, right? Every single species in Montana has used one of those crossings, so we know that animals use them. I think that the big question that, that road ecologists are starting to ask now is basically, okay, so what, right? Animals use these crossings. What does that mean for their populations? Can we document, a federally listed species that has recovered because we put in some wildlife crossings for them? That hasn't been done yet, but I think that's the next piece is, okay, we know they prevent collisions, we know that animals use them, we know that they restore connectivity to some extent. Now can we prove that they actually are helping to recover wildlife populations, not just, keep some individuals alive?
Yeah. And in Wyoming, for example, are they, the recovery of migration memory, is that, any of that been done for the mule deer or the antelope, where they were putting in some of the structures there in the Red Desert?
Yeah, they're hoping to find that out in the coming years because, right, what does happen is that, on I-80, for example, if traffic is cut off a migration route, what happens when you put in a wildlife crossing? We know that migration is a learned behavior that's transmitted from mother to fawn in ungulates. And so, if you put in a wildlife crossing, but there's no more cultural memory of migrating, how do they relearn that behavior? And to my knowledge, that's that kind of the rediscovery of a whole migration route. I'm not sure that's ever really been documented, but if they put in a crossing at I-80, as we hope they do at some point, that'll be kind of an amazing natural experiment.
Yeah, I hope we get a chance to see that.
Me too.
So one of the things you talk a lot about is costs and these being win-win-win projects, but we know that it's really hard to get them financed, and that there's this big celebration of the $350 million in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which Center for Large Landscape Conservation, our co-host, was one of the advocates for. But as someone in your book wrote, that's just decimal dust. It's just a sheer drop in the bucket. What is that? So that sounds like it's maybe 100 frog crossings in Portland.
Right.
Like it's not very much. So I'm sure as you're out there and talking to people, how do we get, the funding, what are the policy ideas that are out there that are salient or that you've seen that have actually been passed at the state level or the federal level that can increase the funding for wildlife accommodation?
Yeah, different states sort of draw upon different pots of money. Wyoming, for example, has basically has like a specialty license plate, a mule deer license plate, and the revenues from that plate go towards wildlife crossings. I don't know how much revenue that's actually raised, but it's kind of a cool symbolic gesture. What we're seeing now is a number of states like California, Utah, Colorado, actually passing state bills that earmark money for wildlife crossings because because basically the way that federal grant program is set up is that the state or the tribe or whoever the applicant is has to provide 20% of the funding, and then the federal government kicks in the other 80%. But you need that 20% match, right? So a number of states are basically saying, okay, let's make that a recurring line item in our budget so that we'll always have money to apply to that federal grant program. Montana hasn't done that yet. There was an effort to get that such a bill passed last year in the last legislative session. It didn't pass. So that's kind of the next push, I think, among connectivity advocates here in Montana is, okay, let's get a bill passed that guarantees us money every single year that we can then leverage to get federal grant funding to build more of these things.
Yeah, that's great. Ben, I could ask you lots of questions, but I'm sure there's some more wisdom or interesting burning questions out here amongst the audience. So let's give folks here a chance who maybe have questions they want to ask Ben about. Start with Steve, and we'll come up here to Doug.
Since we're here at National Park, and you mentioned going to Sun Road study, did you find a higher level of motivation among managers of national parks and wildlife refuges where wildlife protection is the primary purpose?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly, higher compared to the Federal Highway Administration. Yeah, definitely. High enough? I mean, probably not, right? Obviously, look, national parks there's this kind of fascinating tension in national parks. They're places that are simultaneously tasked with, providing for the enjoyment of visitors and conserving the wildlife within them. And, historically, I think they've probably, or at least a lot of them, most of them have erred on the side of providing for visitor enjoyment, right? But of course, you do see parks that have done really radical stuff. There's a chapter in this book about Denali National Park, right? And Denali, in the 1970s, basically banned private vehicles from the vast majority of the main park road. In the 1980s, it restricted annual bus traffic and total vehicle traffic to around 10,000 vehicles per year. And more recently, it basically implemented these sort of timed management of the bus system so that there are what they call sheep gaps, basically these 10-minute intervals once an hour between buses so that Dall sheep or grizzly bears or whatever critter can dart across the road. So that's the sort of thing that obviously park units are capable of doing. I think it's kind of nuts that you can just drive your own personal car around Yellowstone, even though I love doing that myself. I'd love to see every large Western park go to some kind of rigorously managed shuttle system.
Great question, Doug. I think you have your hand up. Okay. Anyone else have a question here? Eric?
Regarding tire noise.
Yeah.
Between owning like trucks and small cars and stuff like that, giving like the idea of like low rolling resistance tires, and like I think they're quieter, but they're definitely quieter than like a truck with like motor tires on them.
Yeah.
Like I've owned some of those and just like, wow, this thing's just yelling down the road. Is there like, at least on like a solo consumer standpoint, is there like something you can do like does that make somewhat of an impact?
That's a good question. I don't really know a ton about different. I don't know who knows something about that. I don't really know. I know that tires in general have gotten quieter over time. I'm not quite sure which are quietest. One other sort of odd tire trade-off, right, is that obviously heavier vehicles cause tires to wear out more quickly. That's one concern with EVs is that their heavy batteries are going to cause very rapid tire erosion. We know those tire particles have big chemical impacts on fish. Anyway, that was just my way of not answering your question, but sounding learned. So it's a great question, and I'd be curious to know more myself.
Any other questions out here? Alyssa?
Those photos you showed on I-90 underpasses, overpasses with the logs down, did they actually monitor and find out if small mammals and little critters were actually using those, or do you know?
Yeah, definitely. Yes, yes. There certainly has been monitoring of those things. I just saw a really cool. There's a really good one under I-25 in Colorado, sort of between Denver and Colorado Springs, and I just attended a presentation. So there's one of those that has a brush line running through it, and one of the researchers studying that just had this incredible series of camera trap videos. Basically, she installed a camera trap kind of in the middle of the brush line and saw every small mammal under the sun, including actually a short-tailed weasel preying on a meadow vole actively inside the brush line, which was kind of cool. So those do get used. I've never seen a really rigorous kind of like randomized control experiment looking at the efficacy of those features, but we know that animals use them.
Actually, I have two questions. The first one is probably a little shorter, and that is simply, like many American consumers who have had a vehicle versus deer altercation,
Yeah.
I've researched devices I can add to my car
Yeah.
that will let the deer know that I'm coming and back away. Did you run across any data that said those devices are effective, or is there anything in the pipeline? So that's the first question. The second question is, locally here we have a decades-long debate about paving versus not paving a storied section of road, at least from Columbia Falls to the western boundary of Glacier National Park. I have not read your book yet, and you may address it there, but it's next in line on my nightstand. I purchased it at Bookworks. The gravel versus pavement in terms of restricting animal movement. Is there any data there on a certain load of traffic that you ran across?
Yeah. Okay, let's see. First question, all of those deer whistles, none of that stuff works. I'm sure you're unsurprised to learn that. I mean, you know, as for the second question, you know, yeah, there are trade-offs, right? You know, yes, unpaved surfaces. You know, I don't know about animal movement across the surface itself, but certainly, obviously, unpaved surfaces dampen vehicle speed, right? And that's, you know, that's really good for preventing collisions. At the same time, you know, unpaved surfaces have dust impacts and erosion impacts that paved surfaces don't have. You know, in Denali, for example, you know, they left that main park road unpaved, which is you know, good for wildlife to some extent, but you know it just created this huge dust problem, and now they spray to control the dust, and the spray that they apply kills roadside vegetation. So there's, you know, there are all of these trade-offs, right? And so, you know, I'm again dodging the question, but you know, different surfaces are going to have different values, and you know, it all depends on the values you're trying to, you know, restore and protect.
In that case, it sounds like speed is critical for the volume of vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, look, we know that basically, you know, 45 miles an hour is sort of like the critical threshold, right? If you're going under 45 miles an hour, you know, both animals have a much better chance of avoiding you, and you have a much better chance of avoiding the animal, right? Especially at night, when if you're going more than 45 miles an hour, you're basically outrunning your headlights. So we know that going slow is good. The problem, obviously, is getting people to drive slowly, right? We have all of these highways with very high design speeds where people feel comfortable driving 70 miles an hour. And so, you know, maybe the best thing we can do is to, create roads that people don't feel comfortable driving fast on, and, you know, leaving them unpaved is one way to accomplish that. Yeah.
I saw the gentleman in the back there.
Yeah, here we have a long history with problems with railroads. You know, power going on the plains, getting
Yeah.
stuck in the wintertime, and grizzly bears getting clipped on the railroads through the mountains. Is there a difference between what makes a good permeable road and what makes a good permeable railroad? Did you look at that at all?
That's a good question. I don't know, Peter. I mean, what do you think about that? You've worked on rail issues here.
A little bit.
Yeah.
I'm pretty light in the literature.
Yeah.
So I don't have much that I can add to that. I know they're trying to figure that out in places like the Balkans and Banff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know,
I know
yeah.
sound's a huge challenge for wildlife on railroads. They don't hear the approaching trains as much, so they're more likely to get caught unawares. And there's also a lot of attracting issues with
Right.
grains. But in terms of the permeability of getting across the railroad, I would assume the structure could be similarly designed, but I don't know much there.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned that there's somebody from NPCA here, right on. And you probably know more about this, but I know that you guys are, there's a high-speed rail line being built through Southern California, and I know that you guys have worked on overpasses for bighorn sheep down there, I believe, over the railroad. So I don't think there's been a whole lot of railroad crossing structures built, but I know that NPCA has worked on that issue in California.
That is so far beyond my knowledge.
Okay. Sorry to put you on the spot.
I do know that here, and one of the things that's been discussed both on the BNSF railing here and also over in Washington, for a lot of the same reasons, is the idea of like taking what we have is the avalanche sheds and making them so that animals and wildlife can cross over them, because some of the problem is wildlife gets in those sheds and they can't get out when a train comes, right? It's just like a puzzle, like you can't get off, you have to either bail off into whatever's 100 feet down below you or whatever. So there has been talk in a lot of places that the idea of adapting those sheds to allow for wildlife passage, and also allowing for like avalanches to move across the top of the tracks without hitting trains would be a thing. Yeah, the desert stuff, I would not be surprised. I've seen a lot of bighorns on the side of railroad tracks, and I suspect, same thing, like they're gonna be more likely to cross over something than under something. But yeah, that's beyond my.
Yeah.
Somebody else gets paid to do
Cool.
that.
Okay. Sorry to put you on the spot, but that's a great answer.
So I have a question. Sometimes I feel like the fences potentially add more of a barrier because you're trying to funnel them to one particular area, but you have miles and miles of fences. So I was curious what you thought about that, because I do see the benefit of those fences and how they are helpful to get the animals to these crossings, but is there a benefit of, on a population scale maybe, yes, you lose a couple animals because they're crossing and it does cause damage, but are you creating more of a barrier to that population by these fences that are filtering to the crossing?
Yeah, definitely. You know, I mean, that's a big concern that I have in in Colorado. I mean, I all the time. I mean, just see that exact problem where where CDOT just fences highways for miles and miles and miles, and puts in one perfunctory underpass, but has certainly exacerbated the connectivity problem. I mean, I think that the key is just putting in enough crossings, right? And I mean, I think that what the recommendation is that if you're mitigating for large ungulates, you want one crossing at least every half mile along a highway. That's a lot of crossings, right? Yeah, and that's. I mean, again, that's the recommendation. That's probably not possible in every single situation, but I think it does. I mean, it does show you that the issue you're identifying is real, and that if you go heavy on the fencing, as DOTs like to do, without installing enough accommodations for connectivity, you can worsen a habitat connectivity problem.
We'll come back to Mark. I see over there.
2 questions. First, I like to think positive. You sell all your books here.
Great, I love it.
Will they be available at my favorite bookstore, which is at the Glacier National Park Conservancy? Do they have them available?
Yeah, I don't know.
Why not? Come on, you do 2 things. You sell your book and you help Glacier National Park.
All right, I will talk to my publicist about that.
Okay, and yeah, we'll try to make that happen, Renee. Naming names. Secondly, as the public at large, what can we do to help make this happen? I mean, my senator knows my name because I write to him quite often. Letters to the papers. What can we do?
Yeah.
How can we help?
Peter, I feel like that could be a good moment to talk about the citizen science stuff, for one thing.
Sure. I'll give one thing, and then we'll kick the question back to you. I think it's a good one in terms of what you've seen in terms of where communities organize. There's a lot of efforts that are underway around Montana right now and elsewhere around the country to bring attention to these problems. And for example, sometimes they're led from the top down where there's problems that are identified by road engineers or ecologists or whatever. But sometimes they're also led very much by bottom-up communities working to say, hey, we have a problem or a concern here, such as our red-legged frogs in Portland. And sometimes it's a mix of how the pressures come together. So depending on where you are and what's going on, there's different ways to get involved. But one thing you can do, at least on Highway 2 right now that we're working on, is helping to provide more information on where we see wildlife commonly crossing the highway or getting struck along the highway. There's a variety of different ways that data is collected by like the Department of Transportation. But one thing we found, and groups have found throughout the region, is that citizen science can help complement that data and sometimes identify gaps that is not in that data. So we have some cards on the back table this was a program that was developed by the Yellowstone State Passages that Half Bend is wearing down on Highway 89 with a very simple phone-based app. It doesn't work on flip phones, and I learned to use a flipper. But it does work on smartphones, where you can then document any wildlife that you see along the corridor. And we're specifically focusing between Columbia Heights and outside of East Glacier, which has been kind of a focal area of concern through the heart of the ground. And so that's opportunistic data, but that can still, if you get enough of those observations, it can help be layered in there with the work that others are doing, radio collar data or more systematic data collection, and can identify some of those hotspots. The other things it does is it helps to show community concern at a larger scale. So I encourage you to pick one of these up. Also, you can sign up for our email list as we continue to ramp up raising awareness and organizing. We'll keep you in touch on other ways to be involved. So.
The other comment is, it's an election year. You know, can we influence our representatives to, hey, this is something that I care about. Where do you stand, sir or ma'am?
It's certainly a question worth asking. I know that there's, as Ben alluded to, there's a lot of conversation about potential legislation in the next legislative session in coming up this spring in Montana around wildlife funding and policy changes to try to push wildlife accommodation to get greater consideration in our Department of Transportation. So certainly asking and voting, if that's an issue that matters to us, and hopefully it does, because we're here tonight, asking our potential representatives that question to see where they stand, and then being engaged during that legislative session it would be another way to help move the needle.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
And just one quick word about the citizen science piece, because I think that piece is so important. So on Highway 89, in the Paradise Valley, where that app was sort of trialed, what they found is that citizen scientists were reporting 6 to 8 times more carcasses than MDT had in its database through crash reports, right? And that's a big deal because, if MDT is saying, well, only X elk and deer are getting killed, a wildlife overpass doesn't really make sense here from a financial perspective. Well, if the real number is 6 to 8X, right, a wildlife crossing is much more likely to pencil out from a cost-benefit perspective in their minds. So that citizen science data component can be hugely important in accurately capturing the scale of the problem and motivating action.
Let's do 2 more questions and then we'll break, and people who want to stick around and ask Ben questions more so or amongst ourselves, please do so. We're in no hurry to get out of here, but we'll ask 2 more questions, and I promise that we'll get to Mason and to Mark. And Mason's had his hand up longer, so I'm going to let him go first, and then Mark will give you the last question.
I know you touched on this a little bit, but is there a difference in success rates between overpasses and underpasses, or does it just kind of vary based on species?
Totally depends on the species. There's some species like mule deer, that will use just like even a box culvert, pretty readily. Whereas others, have a strong preference for really big underpasses or overpasses, right? So grizzly bears, especially sows with cubs, you probably want those overpasses because they want to be kind of up on that bridge deck so they can look out for the older, bigger males who might kill their cubs potentially. Pronghorn are another kind of classic overcrosser. Obviously, the fastest land mammal in North America. They want to be up on a bridge deck to run away from predators potentially. So it's all about what animal you're trying to mitigate for. But if you're trying to get deer across a highway, an underpass is gonna work just fine. It's once you start looking at bears and elk to some extent. Elk you can build a big enough underpass for elk to feel pretty comfortable, but they often do have a slight preference for overcrossings.
And that being said, legislation can be difficult, like in the realm of environmentalism. What would be the most important species to focus on? Would it be the deer because they have the most incidents?
Man.
Would it be something that's endangered like the grizzlies?
It's a great question, and it depends on what values you're trying to capture there, right? Maybe MDT would say the deer are most important to mitigate for, whereas FWP might say grizzly bears, right? Certainly the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would say grizzly bears. So I think that's why providing a few different structures in a stretch of highway that get at those different species it can be pretty important.
Great question. And Mark, you get the last question. Yeah, you can handle it.
In your experience and research, have you come across any recommendations or a toolkit for management biologists that make the mistake of getting schooling in ecology when they should have learned about policy, process, everything?
Oh man.
Interpersonal communication. Do you have any recommendations to jumpstart?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how deep this is in policy, but certainly the communication piece. There's a book by my friend Nancy Barron. Nancy, for a long time, ran a group called Compass, which is basically a science communication training organization. And she has a book called Escape from the Ivory Tower, which is basically about how to not talk like a damn scientist all the time. And I know that lots and lots of scientists have found that book extremely helpful in interacting with the media and policymakers, and just kind of distilling their message to kind of a concise, actionable soundbite. So yeah, Escape from the Ivory Tower by Nancy Barron. I checked that out.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for.
Thanks,
coming.
Peter. Yeah.